Remembering the life of the nation's 41st president. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Amber Strong.
And I'm Jenna Browder. Well, tens of thousands lined up at the nation's Capitol building today to pay their respects to the former president.
That's right. CBN News White House correspondent Ben Kennedy has been following that story all day, and he joins us now from the North Lawn for more. Ben.
Well, Amber, that is right. Today, people from your average American to lawmakers and government officials funnel through the Capitol to honor the life of a former president. His casket will remain there until tomorrow morning. Now, that is when the official state funeral will take place at the Washington National Cathedral. President Trump today had a private meeting with the Bush family, and tomorrow he'll join former Presidents Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and Bush's son, former President George W. Bush, who will deliver a eulogy. Christian artist Michael W. Smith just flew into D.C. and he will be singing his famous song, Friends, during the service. I got the chance to go hear him rehearse today at the Washington National Cathedral, and he told me the song choice is fitting as the two have been friends for, get this, 29 years. Michael said that the nation's 41st president wanted him to sing at his funeral, and it's an honor beyond words.
As we were leaving, we just gave him a hug and said, "Hey, we love you. We love you. Thanks. Just so good to see you." And then, about the time we were back, he kind of get his little finger in the air, and he had that little sparkle in his eye. He said, "Friends are friends forever." That's what he said. That's the last thing he said to us.
And now you're singing Friends.
It's crazy. And Deb and I walked out there thinking, you know what? That might be the last time that we see him.
And CBN News will be bringing you a special live coverage of President Bush's state funeral. You can find that on CBN News channel and CBN News Facebook page beginning at 10:30 a.m. And I'll be back here tomorrow on Faith Nation with a full report. Ben Kennedy, CBN News, the White House.
Thanks, Ben.
Well, Kristen Clark Taylor served in Bush 41's press office during his presidency and vice presidency, and she joins us now with some of her reflections. Kristen, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
What will you most remember about your former boss?
Oh, I'll remember so much. I'll remember his big heart. I'll remember his compassion. I'll remember his sense of humor, all of that. I'll remember the love that he had, really, for his country, for the world, for his family, and for his White House family, of which I was a part.
Wow. You talk a lot about something that I don't think people know, and that's the power of prayer that went on inside of that White House. Can you share a little bit about that with us?
I know that for him and for me, it was, particularly for me, it was the center of everything. It was the reason I was there. It is what made the experience more meaningful. It anchored me to what was right. And there was never a time when I walked into the Oval Office or into a briefing where I didn't pray first. And he was aware of that. And he was a prayerful man, too.
Yeah. Also a family man. Kristen, I know you tell a story about a picnic, a family staff picnic that you all were at. Tell us what happened with your young son when you introduced him for the first time.
He doesn't like me to share the story. He meaning my son, but I'll share it. This was the first time, I think my son was a little under 2, and it was the first time that he'd ever had a hot dog and fruit punch and all that nasty stuff that you're not supposed to have. And the vice president went over to him and shook his hand and put him up on his shoulders. And as I looked up at his shoulders, I said, "Mr. Vice President, you might want to put him down. It looks like he's not feeling very well." Well, of course, Bush was hearing none of it, kind of jostled him around a little, and his cheeks began to inflate. And I wanted to say, "Oh, please put him down." Too late.
Oh, gosh.
All over his face, all over his shoulders, and that's the kind of thing that you just can't orchestrate and you can't control. So, needless to say, the vice president was a little messy.
What was his reaction, though? He was quite gracious, right?
He was quite gracious, and you know why? Because he was a family man. He had children, he had grandchildren. So he just took my son off of his shoulders and kind of moved as much of the mess off of him as he could. And he said, "You know, I think that's going to be the last time I hold your child." But he walked into his home, into the vice presidential residence, cleaned himself up, and that was that.
Wow. You talk about the last experience you had. You went to visit him in 2015, and you actually brought a little something.
Yes.
Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I went and visited my friend, and I brought a note with me from him, which he sent the day after our visit. And by then, and I'd like to say, he had Parkinson's, but the Parkinson's didn't have him. It didn't have him. And we had a wonderful visit together. I flew there just for the day, just for a couple of hours. And he remembered things that I couldn't even begin to remember. And as we were leaving, as I was walking out of his office, I heard him kind of holler out. And I'd never heard him use that decibel level before. But I ran back to his office, and he was sitting in his wheelchair. And he just opened his arms and said, "One more hug?" And I went and gave him a big hug, not knowing that that would be the last time I saw him. So even that is a life lesson, because it teaches us, as it taught me, say your piece to your loved ones before they go. Say I love you, say thank you. And I'm so blessed that I was able to have that moment. And I flew back to D.C. The next day. In my mailbox was a note, and by then it was, the writing was completely illegible, but that he took the time, that he made the effort, that he pushed his hand to say thank you, made all the difference.
Yeah. Kristen, how do you think history will remember this president?
I think history will remember this president as a legend and as one of the greatest political leaders that the world has ever known. In my mind, the greatest. As a war hero, as a leader, as a patriot, and as a man, as a father with a big heart. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kristen Clark-Taylor, thank you so much for being here and just sharing those experiences with our audience.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, the death of President George H.W. Bush is bringing to light just how far removed we've come when it comes to civility here in the United States. Our chief political analyst, David Brody, joins us now with more on that. David, one example you've pointed out is 44's penchant for warm written notes and how that's kind of a lost art now.
Well, that's right, Amber, and he did it a lot. One of his most famous notes was to incoming President Bill Clinton. You know, it was a race, and it was a heartbreaking race and a heartbreaking loss for Mr. Bush, but still in a letter that he left behind to Clinton, he mustered up authentic words, and here they are. He said, "Your success now is our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you."
David, when it comes to our politics, how did we go from such a spirit of civility to where we are today, where there's so much nastiness?
Well, it's been a quick slide. You know, even though President Bush was a man of civility, both parties were really beginning to show strains of incivility, Jenna, even back in his time. Now, the first major seed of bitterness between the two parties was in, here we go, 1987, a trip down memory lane. Robert Bork, nominated by Ronald Reagan to be on the Supreme Court. You know, it turned into a nasty fight. Democrats vilified Bork over issues of race and abortion. The nomination was pulled, but the resentment would linger for years and even decades.
David, I'm starting to feel like that's kind of just the beginning of the downward slide here.
Yes, let's continue the timeline, shall we? Because we have to go to 1991. George H.W. Bush nominates Clarence Thomas, here we go, to the Supreme Court. And once again, a nasty fight is ensuing over allegations of sexual harassment and race. Now, Thomas was eventually confirmed, but those scars remained as well.
Yeah, and to this day, to some extent. That's the last real major crisis point during Bush 41's time in office, right?
Right, and then of course came the turbulent Clinton years, and this is where the unpleasantness really started to reach a whole other level. The whole Monica Lewinsky affair, the impeachment trial that followed, it not only divided both parties, but really, Jenna and Amber, it divided Americans even more so along party lines because camps were forming, political cocoons were growing, and that seemed to be the real big problem at that point.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the contentious election in 2000, if we fast forward a little bit.
Yeah, can you imagine this, right? So we're on the heels of impeachment, 1998-99, and now the famous, or the infamous, we should say, Bush-Gore presidential election, complete with controversy, those hanging chads that we like to talk about. and a lot of bad blood. So look, there are, right there, the roots of a key portion of the political timeline and also how we got there. One last thing also to remember, look, as much as Bush-Gore was winding down, also remember technology and the internet was just winding up. So since then, it's pretty much been much easier for people to find lots of different sources of information. Some are true, some not so true. And typically people will gravitate to the information they want to believe. Hence, we have, what do? We have more of an insulated bubble society. We live in it today, and that leads obviously to that lack of civility that we've been talking so much about.
Yeah, David, you just described a pretty quick erosion of civility in our politics and here in Washington over, gosh, the course of about 10 years.
Well, time is money, Jenna. We got to keep it moving.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
As people make their way through the Capitol to remember the life of President Bush, lawmakers are continuing to work through this lame duck session of Congress. For more on that, we turn to Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson. Abby, lawmakers only have a couple of weeks to get a lot done in this session, but then we have the funeral tomorrow and the government shutdown. How has that affected the schedule there on Capitol Hill?
Well, Washington is on pause this week while they honor the life of President George H.W. Bush, who's currently lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda until his funeral tomorrow at the Washington National Cathedral. The House has canceled votes this week, and the Senate has paused them until after the funeral tomorrow afternoon. And last week there was talk about lawmakers being dismissed Friday until next year, but now it's looking like they will be here for the next 2 weeks, getting the work that they need to get done by the end of the year.
Yeah, Abby, the deadline for a shutdown was supposed to be this Friday, but that has been pushed back, right?
Yes, well, on Monday, a bipartisan group of lawmakers from the House and Senate agreed on a 2-week stopgap spending bill, so that way they could spend this week honoring President H.W. Bush and celebrating his life and not worried about this threat of a government shutdown on Friday. So this stopgap spending bill now pushes the deadline to December 21st. It buys them 2 more weeks to come up with compromises and fund the rest of the government that they have yet to do so, and it gives them 2 more weeks to work on a compromise on things like border security and how much is going to go towards building the wall and increasing security at the southern border.
Abby, you got a chance to speak with Senator Lankford today about government shutdowns. What did he have to say?
Well, there are a few senators here on the Hill, like Senator Lankford, who are just upset that we are constantly seeing these threats of government shutdowns. So he has introduced a bill that would prevent government shutdowns and make sure that only Congress faces consequences if they don't fund the government in time. Here's a look at what he has to say.
For years, I have fought against this whole principle of having government shutdown fights. I just don't think they help us as a nation. I don't think they help us internationally. I don't think they help us with our own economy even. When you're constantly fighting about a government shutdown, then you're always distracted over what the real issues are. So I have a bill that stops the government shutdowns that basically says if the funding is not done in place, the budgets are not done, the next step, the appropriation bills are not done, Congress has to stay in session until it gets done. But we have automatic funding that happens the same as last year's funding that keeps going until Congress resolves. But at the same time, Congress has to stay here until they get the next year's funding. So basically the American people are not held hostage. Congress is. That Congress has to be able to stay here and to be able to get its work done rather than it's not done. So we do these government shutdown fights or extensions and the American people go through all the turmoil. Let's put the pressure where the pressure needs to be.
Now, he told me that he's working on getting support for this bill. He says a lot of lawmakers will nod their heads and say they support this, but he does worry that if it were to come to the Senate floor, how they would vote on it.
Abigail Robinson on Capitol Hill. Thanks so much, Abby.
Well, coming up, the head of the CIA heads to Capitol Hill to brief senators on the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Well, some senators heard firsthand today from the CIA director on the death of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. And from what they say, the briefing from Gina Haspel left little doubt over who is responsible for his murder.
MBS, the Crown Prince, is a wrecking ball. I think he's complicit in the murder of Mr. Khashoggi. to the highest level possible. There's not a smoking gun, there's a smoking saw.
I have zero question in my mind that the Crown Prince, MBS, ordered the killing, monitored the killing, knew exactly what was happening, planned it in advance. If he was in front of a jury, he would be convicted in 30 minutes, guilty.
Now, although the CIA points to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, known as MBS, for Khashoggi's killing, the Trump administration continues its support for him, maintaining Saudi Arabia is a crucial ally in the Middle East.
For more now, we turn to Varsha, Kota from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Varsha, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So the administration's response to the Khashoggi killing hasn't been enough, to say the least, from a lot of lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. What do you think it will mean for U.S.-Saudi relations if Congress takes those steps to rebuke Saudi Arabia?
I think there's no doubt right now that Saudi Arabia's stock in Congress is very low, and we're seeing bipartisan pushback against Saudi Arabia. And the split over Saudi Arabia between the administration and Congress is nothing new. I think the administration has always leaned a little bit more pro-Saudi than Congress has, but Saudi Arabia's moves over the past year has really served to shake up its image in Washington, D.C. And we see some of the most direct actions now with the war in Yemen. I think that's really become the battleground for how congressional opinion over the Khashoggi killing is going to play out. And what's very surprising is that a group of senators who voted against previous measures to pull back U.S. support for the war in Yemen have now said that if that measure comes to the floor again, they will back it, which is a pretty big shift.
Varsha, what would it mean for the U.S. to pull support to back out of involvement from that war in Yemen?
The administration has always maintained that if the U.S. reduces its support, then it's going to lead to more haphazard, more indiscriminate targeting from the Saudi and UAE-led coalition. The U.S. doesn't have direct combat support. It's limited to, well, it was limited to refueling, mid-air refueling, which was revoked a few weeks ago. But we still provide intelligence, we still provide reconnaissance services, we still provide no-strike lists to help the coalition do better targeting and things like that. Materially, if the U.S. were to pull back its support, I don't think this is going to cause the Saudi-UAE coalition to rethink their involvement in Yemen. And that's because their threat perception of the conflict is not likely to change. They're going to continue to view the Iran-backed Houthis on their southern border as the development of a new Hezbollah in the Gulf, so to say. And it might, as the administration says, we might see some less professional capabilities from the coalition if U.S. support is pulled back, but I doubt that it would lead the coalition to announce an immediate ceasefire or truce or anything like that.
What else could lawmakers do?
I think that in general, Congress's ability to act is a little bit restrained right now because, as the administration has rightfully pointed out, we have a duty to punish Saudi Arabia for the intransigent over Khashoggi's killing. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia is one of the U.S.'s main partners in the region. It is a huge counterterrorism partner. We rely on them to stabilize oil markets. They're a very big economic partner to the United States. And the security dimensions, too, are very, very deep. So the administration has tried to strike a very delicate balance between pushing back against some of these disturbing moves we've seen coming out of Saudi Arabia. Certainly, Khashoggi's killing is the pinnacle of that very worrying, destabilizing trend, while at the same time not throwing the entirety of the partnership into the fire.
And that's just the thing. It is a partnership. Lindsey Graham also pointed out that the idea that we're going to somehow lose the Saudi support if we implement harsher sanctions is a farce. Can you back that up, or is there anything that you see that the U.S. would lose or could stand to lose from backing harsher penalties towards Saudi Arabia?
I think the Saudis are playing a clever geopolitical game. They are showing the U.S. that with the emergence of China and Russia as more active partners in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia does have options to choose from. And I think that's a very valid point for them to make. And when it comes to investment deals, the Chinese will be there. When it comes to military equipment, the Russians will be there. When it comes to oil cooperation, the shared interests between the Saudis and Russians right now are greater than the shared interests between the Saudis and the U.S. So The U.S. does have something to lose. And the question right now, we've seen this playing out now for about 2 months since Khashoggi first went missing. The question is, what's the most effective means of pushing back while not giving Saudis any reason to burn those very important pillars that have been established over the 6-7 decade-long U.S.-Saudi alliance?
Yeah, a delicate balance to strike for sure. Varsha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a rough day on Wall Street. The Dow Jones Industrial Average took a dive today. The Dow was down 799 points at the close of trading, and the S&P down 3.1%. Experts say today's dip comes after uncertainty over U.S. trade.
We'll still ahead on Faith Nation, why the vice president is taking a stand against Airbnb. The popular vacation rental property service known as Airbnb is taking sides in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. The company removed listings of Jewish landholders in Judea and Samaria.
Vice President Pence recently weighed in, calling the move wrong. As Chris Mitchell explains, the one-sided policy has some charging anti-Semitism.
This is Villa Herodian in Tekoa, about 15 minutes south of Jerusalem. Owned by American-Israeli Louis Weinger and his family, it's one of some 200 properties affected by Airbnb's West Bank boycott. The Weingers host events and can sleep up to 14 people in their luxurious home. It has a spectacular view of the Judean hills, and it's listed on Airbnb, but not for long.
I think it's crazy. It just doesn't make any sense that I can't list my property, but Mohammed down the street in Bethlehem can list his property and call it Palestine.
Airbnb operates in 191 countries in 81,000 cities, but it said in a press release, when we applied our decision-making framework, we concluded that we should remove listings in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank that are at the core of the dispute between Israelis and Palestinians.
That's obviously taking a position, a political position that I believe is discriminatory and anti-Semitic.
I think our reaction should be that we could boycott Airbnb. And anybody who cares about Israel, the Jewish people, is willing to fight against anti-Semitism should fight against Airbnb.
Israeli government minister Michael Oren says the Airbnb boycott could be just the beginning.
It sends a signal that not just Jewish companies in Judea and Samaria can be boycotted, but the Jewish state can be boycotted. And we've known throughout history that waves of anti-Semitism, most recently the Nazi anti-Semitism of the 1930s, 1940s, began with a boycott of Jewish goods. This is the way it begins.
Airbnb's policy discriminates grossly against people of the Jewish faith and people of the Jewish ethnicity. They treat Jews living in the West Bank different from any other group.
Professor Eugene Kontrarovich said out of the whole world, Airbnb chose to make a point here.
There is indeed a political dispute about the West Bank, but they're not saying we're not taking listings from the West Bank. They're saying we're not taking listings from Jews in the West Bank. That's not just a double standard, that's naked discrimination.
Weinger's neighbor, Rabbi Eitan Levy, explained the Jewish roots of the area.
Tekoa itself was the home of the prophet Amos. In the 9th chapter of Amos, he says that God will return his people Israel, they will rebuild their conquered cities, they will sink down their roots and never more be uprooted from the land. And right here, you can come to the modern Tekoa, and here we are, we're living out those prophecies today.
For now, Weinger says he doesn't know what impact being unlisted on Airbnb will have on his business. But whatever happens, Levy says God will provide. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, that's going to do it for today's Faith Nation.
And don't forget, CBN News will be bringing you special live coverage of President Bush's state funeral. You can find that on CBN News channel and CBN News Facebook page beginning at 10:30 a.m.
We'll see you tomorrow.